What is al-Quran, and why did it first develop? What is Tawil or Tafsir? What is Israeliyat? And who was Muqatil ibn Sulaiman? Describe the methods and functions of classical tafsir and Tawil. What are the Asbab al-Nazul? When both Muslims and non-Muslims discuss Islam's stance on a certain topic, usually they go first to the Quran. Asking what does the Quran say is usually just a byword for what does Islam say. And this move isn't unique to Islam, of course. People do this with Christianity and the Gospel, and Judaism and the Torah. But these questions are deeply flawed. Not only do people not often live directly out of their sacred scriptures literally, even if they think they do, there is little consensus across the board about what these texts mean with any degree of specificity. We can pretty safely claim that the Quran says that God is one, Muhammad is God's messenger, charity is good, and so on like that, but if you want some more detail, you're going to pretty quickly discover that asking what the Quran, or the Torah, or the Gospel say about something is no easy task at all. We've met this problem in a number of ways already. The philosophers, theologians, and muftis have been debating the meaning of the Quran as long as the historical records of Islam goes back. We would probably have to go completely out of our way to find a verse of the Quran where there hasn't been some debate over it somewhere in Islamic history. And while we can celebrate the diversity of Islam that these debates show us, it still gets a bit infuriating that there's not a simple answer to straightforward questions about the Quran and its meaning. The question not only of what does the Quran say, but what does the Quran mean, is called the Ulum al-Quran, the sciences of the Quran. Not only that the Quran says something, but how are we to interpret the Quran? How are we to explain what the Quran has to say? This is what we call in English hermeneutics, the discussion and study of how to interpret an artifact. What is the best way to understand what you're seeing and hearing? What does a certain word mean? How are we to interpret this grammar? Are we to take this passage literally, symbolically, poetically, or metaphorically? Are we supposed to understand this or not? Are there multiple possible meanings? How does one's historical, cultural, and linguistic context affect the meaning of the artifact, or not? If, as we've said previously, Islam is in a certain way a history of the Quran being read and reread, then the Ulum al-Quran is the history of those rereadings. Not just what does the Quran say, but how does a certain Muslim, at a certain moment in time, understand it? Perhaps an example is in order. Once upon a time, in the days of the Prophet Muhammad, these 3 Quranic verses were spoken by him on 3 different occasions. The first one takes place between a man who is dead or dying and God. The man is begging God to return to life so that he can correct the mistakes that he made while he was alive. Until, when death comes to one of them, he says, "My Lord, send me back, so that I might work righteousness concerning what I left undone." Surely no is the word that he speaks. Behind them is a barzakh until the day when they will be raised up. Our question here is about this word, barzakh. What does it mean? It seems to be a barrier of some kind that keeps the dead dead until the day of resurrection. This word, barzakh, also appears in 2 other Quranic passages. He let loose the 2 seas which meet. Between them is a barzakh, which they do not seek to cross. He it is who let loose the 2 seas, this one sweet and fresh, the other one salty and bitter, and placed between them a barzakh, and a restricted obstruction. Here, in these two passages, the barzakh is like a dam of some kind that keeps two bodies of water away from each other. But our question here is, what does the first use of the term, where the barzakh keeps the living and the dead away from each other, have to do with this second and third ayat, where the barzakh is a barrier between two bodies of water? So how are we to interpret this word, barzakh? We can guess from context that the word barzakh means some kind of a barrier. But what does keeping the dead and the living separate have to do with keeping two seas separate? Now, there are no pre-Islamic Arabic dictionaries in which we could look the word barzakh up. Remember, there's no pre-Islamic books at all. And this word, barzakh, does not appear in the seerah, in any known hadith, sound or otherwise, and in none of the pre-Islamic poetry. To make the matters worse, the word barzakh does not seem to have a Semitic root. If you know Arabic, you can tell that barzakh does not follow the normal forms of a word, and neither is there a comparable word in languages related to Arabic, like Aramaic, Syriac, or Hebrew. So we have this word, barzakh, that the Quran just throws out there 3 times, and we have no real way to interpret it. Since the Quran doesn't explain what the word means, we have to suppose that the original audience in the 7th century were just presumed to understand what this word meant without further explanation. But later people, even Arabic speakers, debated the meaning of this word for centuries. Well, this is a problem of ulum al-Quran, the Quranic sciences, Quranic hermeneutics. If what the Quran says and means is so important to Muslims, what are we to do in a situation like this with the term barzakh? Well, over the course of Islamic history, the exegetes, the interpreters of the Quran, have thrown everything in the kitchen sink at passages like this in attempts to get to the bottom of them. While the Prophet was alive, we have to assume that the people of his ummah understood the Quran more or less as it was. It was speaking to people living in their own historical context, who presumably also knew about the vocabulary, stories, grammar, and allusions that the Quran made. The primary audience of the Quran, we have to guess, didn't need much help interpreting the Quran. If they didn't understand it, they wouldn't have adopted it as a prophecy, right? And even if there was something in the Quran that wasn't entirely clear as is, the Prophet Muhammad was still standing before them. They could just ask for clarification if something in the revelation wasn't obvious. But there are some instances in the Quran when the revelation itself says that there's more to all this than surface readings. We've already noted that the Quran sometimes speaks in mathals, parables, allegorical stories, that require the listener or reader to interpret the message for meanings that are not direct. Indeed, a mathal by its very nature means that you have to pull some kind of meaning out of the Quran that's not given to you directly. So, in that sense, the Quran itself insists that you have to do some personal interpretation. And the Quran even says from time to time that the hearer or reader isn't going to understand everything it's saying, and perhaps isn't supposed to. He it is who revealed the book to you. Some of its verses are clear, muhkamat. They are the mother of the book. Others are allegorical, mutashabihat. Then, as for those in whose heart there is a sickness, they follow the part of it which is allegorical, seeking to mislead and seeking to give it their own interpretation. But none knows its interpretation except God. The Quran itself says that some of its verses are clear as is, and these are the mother of the book. This is an idiom for the key part of something, the quintessential part. So these clear verses of the Quran are the heart of what the Quran is saying. And yet, some other verses are purposefully not clear. They're allegorical. And people who are not thinking clearly, honestly, or humbly will presumably use such verses to make the Quran say whatever they want it to say. And so it isn't just an issue of receiving a revelation from God. It is interpreting a revelation properly and knowing which parts you have the ability to interpret at all. One of the Quran's own justifications for why God keeps sending prophets with more messages is this very reason. Each revelation clarifies not only what people have forgotten or ignored, but what they've misinterpreted. For instance, look at this verse which discusses why some of the ancient people of the book are damned, even though they've received guidance from God. So for their breaking of the covenant, we cursed them and made their hearts hard. They twist words from their meanings and have forgotten a part of what they were reminded. So you can't just rest on your laurels because God has spoken to you and your people. You need to understand what God is saying, and where God is being clear and where God is being allegorical. And there's a punishment for those who misread what they've been given, those who twist the words of their meanings like many ancient Jews or Christians supposedly did. What happens when the Prophet Muhammad dies and there's no one around in direct contact with God, and therefore no one who is absolutely sure what every word of the Quran means, which parts are to be taken at face value and which require interpretation? We noticed this previously regarding the issue of the first caliphs and the succession to the Prophet, from which the first Shiites emerged. The Quran never addressed who is to lead the Ummah when the Prophet dies in any literal way, and so as soon as he's dead, the Ummah almost immediately broke into debate about how to apply Islam to this new situation. Well, this issue of succession was hardly the only matter like this. As the years rolled on, and the primary audience of the Quran were decades and then centuries in the past, these issues kept cropping up. In fact, they got increasingly worse. No one spoke the 7th century Hijazi dialect of the Quran anymore. There were words and references that became obscure, like the word barzakh we just met. Clearly someone in the Hijaz in the early 7th century should know what the word barzakh means without any explanation. But centuries later, the Arabic language changed. New words were introduced. Old words were forgotten or changed in meanings. So again, how are we to interpret the Quran when we're not its primary audience? There's no prophet to ask, no book to look up these words like in a dictionary, no other written sources at all, really. In response to this, the Ulum al-Quran developed. The principal genre of these Islamic sciences of the Quran were later to be called either tafsir or tahwil. Both words mean interpretation or exegesis, referring to the interpretation of the Quran specifically. In the centuries leading into the classical Islamic period, later commentators would write books which explained what part or all of the Quran meant. These are the books of tafsir or tahwil. The commentator, the mufassir, would write out part or all of the Quran, and in writing would attempt to explain what the Quran was talking about. The meaning of odd words or unusual grammars, the backstories to Quranic tales that lacked detail, and so on. There were a lot of different ways that these first books of tafsir or ta'wil worked. The earliest examples of the genre were basically just paraphrases of the Quran. The author would write out the text of the Quran itself, and then, when an element came up that the author thought was unclear, they would just throw in a little comment to make sure the reader understood. An early instance of this paraphrastic tafsir of the Quran was by Muqatil ibn Sulaiman. Muqatil was born in Balkh, modern Afghanistan. He would travel to Iraq, Syria, and Arabia, like so many scholars did, each in search of information about the first Ummah and the Prophet who founded it. Notice that he lived at the dawn of the Abbasids in 750, the same time as Ibn Ishaq, the author of the Sirah, and Malik, the author of the Book of the Well-Worn Path, who both also tried in their own ways to get to the bottom of early Islamic history. But Muqatil's way wasn't through writing a biography of Muhammad or collecting hadith, but instead he wrote the first detailed tafsir, a commentary on the Quran. Here is Muqatil on two of the first verses of the written Quran. Praise be to God. That means, thanks be to God, the Lord of the worlds. That means, of the jinn and of humanity. See what Muqatil is doing here. He cites a little bit of the Quran. Then he immediately explains what that means using a paraphrase. He's translating the Arabic into Arabic, as it were. He's making sure the reader understands every single word. That is, Muqatil, who is writing about 130 years after Muhammad's death, understands that the Arabic language has changed in that time, or that some things that the Quran says are regionalisms that only people from the Hijaz would know. And so, to make sure that everyone knows what the Quran is saying, Muqatil just rephrases the Quran from beginning to end. Another technique common to the early tafsir or ta'wil of the Quran, written by people like Muqatil, was the use of the ISUII016, literally Israelite stuff. Remember that the first audience of the Quran in the Hijaz centuries before were Jews, Christians, and pagans. They only became Muslims later, and slowly. Therefore, the first audience of the Quran knew the kinds of things that Jews, Christians, and pagans would know about. Biblical stories, the wisdom of Jewish rabbis and Christian saints, sayings attributed to ancient prophets, and so on. But by Muqatil's time, many people were born and raised Muslims, and even their parents may have been born and raised Muslims. And so that means they didn't necessarily grow up knowing about all that Jewish and Christian lore. And some of that stuff you need to know. You need some of that Israelite stuff if you want to understand the Quran. Here is Muqatil talking about the story that the Quran calls the Companions of the Cave. Do you think that the Companions of the Cave, Kaf? The cave, Kaf, was a hole in the body of a mountain, a cavern. So here is this odd Quranic word, Kaf, and Muqatil is paraphrasing again. But notice that he doesn't just explain that the word Kaf means cave. It does, but he specifically knows that this is a cave in a mountainside. How does he know that? The Quran doesn't say so. Well, because the story that the Quran calls the Companions of the Cave was a well-known story to late antique Christians, and they would have known that the cave in that story was on a mountain. So this is an example of Israeliyat. Ancient Christians knew that this cave was on a mountain. The Quran references this cave but doesn't say where it is, and so Muqatil could take a detail from some Christian version of the story and use it to give more explanation to the Quranic story. Even early commentators like Muqatil struggled with an issue that seemed inherent in interpreting the Quran. Who is to say that the Quran only has one level of meanings? If the Quran is from God, and the Quran itself says that some of it's to be taken at face value, and some of it is allegorical, doesn't that mean that there's more than one way to interpret the Quran correctly? Must it not have layers of meanings and interpretations, addressing different kinds of people and in different ways? Consider, for instance, this hadith, attributed to one of the Sahaba, Abdullah ibn Abbas. The Quran has 4 readings, Tafsir, which is known to scholars. Arabic, which is known to the Arabs. The allowed and the forbidden, which no one can be ignorant of. And Ta'wil, which is known to God alone. So we can take the Quran in 4 ways at once. We can read it literally, as in on the linguistic level that requires knowledge of Arabic. And we can read it as a rule book for what to do and not do, which would be required of all Muslims because this is how they're going to live a Muslim life. We can read it as scholars, meaning those who know about the history of the early Ummah, fiqh, and other Islamic sciences. And we can read it as God reads it, which is full of mysteries that transcend human understanding. And notice here, by the way, that tafsir and ta'wil do not mean the same thing. Around the 10th century, the words tafsir and ta'wil as genres are going to spin off in 2 different directions. Tafsir would, in time, and still today, come to refer to the outer meaning of the Quran, how to read it as a piece of literature. What do all of the words and references in the Quran mean? By the 10th century, to say that a book is tafsir means that it's a commentary on how to read the Quran on its surface. This would include how it relates to the seerah and a hadith, which you can use to interpret the Quran, but it would also include knowledge of ancient Arabic poetry, as these poems can be used to explain the meanings of old Arabic words that the Quran sometimes employs. And tafsir could also refer to rationalist readings of the Quran, such as a philosopher's, or a Mutazilites, or an Ash'arites. And of course, it could mean any combination of these things. What the commentators who wrote tafsir in this sense were trying to avoid was tafsir bil-ra'i, interpreting based on one's personal opinions. In other words, not just picking up the Quran and saying what you think it means, but rather, how can you demonstrate what the Quran means using systematic methods and reliable sources? Referring to the traditions of the first Muslims, or the language of the ancient Arabs, or the rationalist approach of the philosophers and theologians. Each of these, in their own ways, tried to study the Quran in a consistent way throughout, and demonstrate to the reader how they arrived at this particular reading of the Quran. These classical commentaries also tried to avoid Israeliyat, because these, by definition, didn't come from Muslims, and therefore could not be considered reliable. By the 14th century, tafsir had become a proper science on its own, with fixed methods and approaches, based on the madhabs, the schools of fiqh. Remember how the classical madhabs all used a hierarchy of authorities when it came to making a fatwa? First, you check the Quran, then the Sunnah of the Prophet, or of the Imams too if you were a Shiite, and then the consensus of the community, and so on. Well, slowly, the genre of tafsir grew to match these methods. In other words, if you wanted to know what a certain part of the Quran meant, first, you checked other parts of the Quran that might explain the part that you don't understand. Then you would look to the prophetic traditions, the ahadith, for anecdotes that might explain what the Quran was about. And finally, if you didn't find your answers in the Quran itself or in the hadith, you could look to other authoritative Islamic sources that would explain to you the part of the Quran that you were curious about. This would, at least in theory, lead to consistent readings of the Quran, as you were working with a fixed number of source materials. The ideal source of information would be to find the asbab an-nuzul, literally the occasions of revelation, or the reasons for the Quran coming down. These were stories, mostly found in hadith, in which someone explained the exact moment in the life of the Prophet when a Quranic verse first appeared, and presumably, this would explain the context of the verse as perfectly as possible. For example, meet the 14th century commentator Ismail ibn Kathir, who lived in Syria. Ibn Kathir was specifically interested in reading the Quran through the Hadith. Oddly, Ibn Kathir was not considered a particularly noteworthy scholar of the Quran in his own day. But nowadays, he's often considered one of the greatest mufassirs who ever lived, because he employed such a regular methodology when looking at the Quran. Regarding the same first verses of the Quran that we saw from Muqatil previously, Ibn Kathir cites one of the Asbab an-Nuzul, a story from the life of Muhammad which claims to say the exact context when a certain verse of the Quran appeared in history. In this case, he cites a hadith from al-Bukhari. Abu Sa'id al-Mu'alla said, "While I was praying in the masjid, God's messenger called me, but I did not respond to him. Later I said, 'O messenger of God, I was praying.' He said, 'Didn't God say, give your response to God to his messenger when he calls you?' Then he said to me, 'Before you leave the masjid, I will teach you a surah which is the greatest surah in the Quran.' Then he got hold of my hand, and when he intended to leave, I said to him, 'Didn't you say to me, I will teach you a surah which is the greatest surah in the Quran?' And he, Muhammad, said, 'Praise be to God, the Lord of the worlds.'" Notice what Ibn Kathir did and didn't do here. He gave us one of the Asbab an-Nuzul, a story from the life of Muhammad in which a passage of the Quran appeared. So Abu Sa'id al-Mu'alla said that he didn't answer Muhammad when he was called because he was busy praying. And so Muhammad taught him a better prayer, the surah of the opening, the first surah of the Quran, which is the one to this day which is recited when one performs the salat. But what Ibn Kathir didn't do was attempt to use his own opinion to explain the meanings of the verses, unlike Muqatil's commentaries on the same verses. Ibn Kathir simply pointed the reader to the proper sources of further information. That said, the interpretation of the Quran by personal experience and opinion didn't just stop as tafsir became more systematized. Rather, that job passed to the ta'wil, which in the Middle Ages came to refer to commentaries on the esoteric or inner meanings of the Quran. This is the Quran as understood by one's own personal insights, or spiritual experiences, or mystical knowledge. Ta'wil is not as scholarly, historical, or legalistic as tafsir is, but rather serves as a kind of meditation on the mysteries of the Quran. For example, allow me to introduce to you one Sahal al-Tustari. Tustari was a Persian born in Khuzestan province on the Persian Gulf Coast. He was a mystic, someone who renounced worldly ties and wealth, and tried to live a simple life of prayer, fasting, and meditating on the mysteries of God. Regarding the same verses of the Quran that we looked at from Muqatil and Ibn Kathir before, Tustari says, "The meaning of praise be to God is thanks be to God, for thankfulness to him is obedience to him. Obedience to him is protection from him. The meaning of the Lord of the worlds is that he is the Lord of all the creations and the one who raises them and cares for them. He is the one who watches over their affairs and the one who corrects and orders things for them, even before their actions are brought into being. He deals with them all according to his eternal knowledge of them, as he wills, and for whatever purpose he wills, wishes, rules, and decrees, regarding what is obliged and what is forbidden. They have no Lord but him." This is ta'wil, the interpretation of the inner meaning of the Quran. It's quite different than what we see in the tafsir by someone like Ibn Kathir. Rather than telling the reader where to go looking for historical information on these Quranic lines, Tustari reflects on them and what they imply. How does one praise God, or what does it mean to declare that God is the Lord of the worlds? How does this make one feel? How do these lines reveal the hidden truth of God? What is Ulum al-Quran? And why did it first develop? What is Tawil or Tafsir? What is Israeliyat? And who was Muqatil ibn Sulaiman? Describe the methods and functions of classical tafsir and ta'wil. What are the asbab and nazul?